Salam, folks. This is an interesting video that I'm making today. It's one which I've made after quite a long hiatus, about a month. And I do owe an explanation to those of you who watch my videos. You see, obviously, recently the month of Ramadan has occurred. And Ramadan, as you know, is a spiritual month for many Muslims. And during that month, my routine obviously was quite busy, so I was not able to make these videos like I normally would. But in the last 10 days of this holy month, I engaged in an activity called i'tikaf. I'tikaf is when essentially you sit and isolate yourself in a mosque for 10 days. You're not allowed to leave the mosque, that is. And essentially, it's a kind of spiritual retreat. You can obviously eat and shower and whatever and do your daily activities, but obviously you have to stay in the mosque and you engage in worship and whatever. And it certainly was a spiritual, reflective, and meditative experience for me. I thought it would be worthwhile because I was reading and writing quite a lot during my i'tikaf. I thought it would be important to discuss the development of my views. I think it's about time that I explained my sort of intellectual and spiritual journey and from what perspective I'm talking about different things. Of course, this is in light of the very recent spiritual developments that I have undergone in the i'tikaf as well. To begin with, it's important to note that my views have evolved considerably. Of course, throughout my time and throughout my, years studying history and philosophy. And of course, I'm not like some old person. I'm 19. I'm quite young. But of course, I have been studying these kinds of topics since I was about 13 or 14. At times, of course, not very seriously, just casually. At other times, I've been reading a lot of books about these subjects. And so I've undergone various different stages in my intellectual journey and intellectual development. For example, I began very much as this kind of centrist liberal, right? I had the typical, liberal sort of views about different subjects when I was, let's say, going into my teenagers, let's say when I was starting high school in, of course, the context of the United Kingdom. But slowly and surely, I began to evolve as I started to learn about different worldviews and different perspectives, and also things to do with my journey with my faith, which I will be discussing later on. So, the various different viewpoints that I have had at one point or another, although these are not necessarily in any chronological order, they are left leaning. So I was at one point quite sympathetic towards various leftist ideologies. I've also had a kind of reactionary or fundamentalist phase where I, had some pretty extreme religious views, let's say. At certain points, I was also very much into this kind of enlightened centricism. And at one point, I was also very much into this kind of libertarian ideology as well. The point is to show that I've undergone various developments and I've believed in various different ideologies or various different ideas at one point or another. It is interesting to note that I've never had a kind of Marxist or communist phase. Of course, a lot of young people do have that kind of phase, at least, where they subscribe to some kind of Marxist ideology. But I've never really adhered to any kind of Marxist ideology. Although I've been sympathetic to certain leftist ideologies, like I've said in the past, I've never necessarily been a full out Marxist. Perhaps that's because I'm not necessarily somebody who subscribes to any kind of materialism. I'm not somebody who really believes in a kind of purely materialist paradigm. And so, based on that alone, Marxism and even things like hyper-capitalism, for example, I am not particularly, sort of attracted to. And that's important to know because there's always been a kind of philosophical or more non materialist element to my worldview. Of course, it wasn't just the intellectual and spiritual aspects that shaped my views throughout my life, which isn't much because I'm 19, but just for the few years that I've been thinking about these things, but also based on my personal life experiences. Of course, there are things that I have done which I am proud of, and there are also things that I have done which I'm not really proud of, and in fact, I'm rather ashamed of, and I'd rather not talk about. But nevertheless, I mean, being young and being a teenager, you make a lot of silly mistakes, and the most important thing is to be able to move forward from them. And I've tried my best, obviously, to sort of decrease or not let my biases, my personal life biases, interfere with my worldview. Although, of course, they do play a part, and I will discuss that as well later. Now, this actually does raise another important point, which is about religion and, in particular, organized religion. Of course, I am from a Pakistani background and I grew up in your typical Desi household. My parents, bless them, they weren't particularly harsh on me. They gave me a relative degree of freedom to do what I wanted, but they also did teach me the basics of, the Muslim faith, the Islamic faith. And, everyone, I guess, has their phase when they're young, when they are doubtful of their faith or they go through challenges. And of course, I was no different. I did have doubts regarding the faith. And of course, many of these were answered on a philosophical level when I began studying the faith. But of course, I've had periods where I've gone through doubts now and then and, over and over again. And studying history, studying theology, studying philosophy, of course, there's a kind of conception that we often have of religion as these very idealistic things. But it becomes obvious that when you study history, when you study the development of these worldviews, that there's a very human aspect to them. And this human aspect is quite fallible. My channel and the work I've done on the various platforms that I post on, in a way, has been a documenting, a kind of recording of my intellectual and spiritual journey and progress. And in that sense, of course, you can see or trace perhaps the way that I've developed with my faith or with the ideas of my faith. However, recently, especially as part of my experience in this kind of isolation in the mosque, I have developed a degree of certainty about the truthfulness of my faith. Of course, this isn't dogmatic, and I welcome criticism and I welcome people's questions or people's responses to what I'm saying. And, by no means do I want to like preach to people because I'm certainly the last person who should be preaching. But I just think it's worth mentioning that I have developed a degree of certainty or some kind of certainty regarding the validity of my faith. And of course, I welcome different questions, I welcome different objections, I welcome different viewpoints. And this channel very much is about studying different viewpoints, studying different ideas, coming to terms with the different ideas, and trying to appreciate the good things about them. But you will, of course, see that I do draw on things quite heavily from a very Islamic perspective. Perhaps people do get confused when they watch my videos because I pull on quite different sort of threads, let's say. I, on the one part, pull upon this kind of philosophical, metaphysical thread, and it's very much a kind of abstract one where you have to take a step back from your context and try and be neutral when examining different ideas on a very abstract level or theoretical level. But then there's also this kind of historical or psychosociological approach that I do at times take. And if we're talking about identity or upon more civilizational lines, then there are two distinct ones which crop up throughout my videos. One is the kind of Western identity that I have, of course, being raised in the UK and living in a Western society. But the other one is the more Oriental Islamic kind of identity, of course, being the religion and the culture of my parents and being my kind of heritage, my ancestral sort of heritage. And so, of course, when it comes to the Islamic tradition, I draw upon a lot of metaphysical and philosophical ideas from that. I've talked about the need for a kind of metaphysical framework by which we can operationalize our fundamental philosophical assumptions about the world properly. And I've also talked about certain deeper meanings or themes that can be found within certain Quranic allegories or accounts. For example, I've talked about the people of the cave, the story of the cave in the Quran, and the kind of deeper meanings in relation to it. But of course, I also draw upon this kind of Western theme. I quote a lot of Western historians, a lot of Western academics and sociologists, for example. And I do, quite heavily read both the works of Western academics and scholars and Muslim scholars and academics. So you will find these different themes playing out in different videos I have made or in my different works. However, what I can say is that I have tried to conceive of a broader philosophical and metaphysical and historical framework to, base my ideas on. And I do draw upon elements of the two intellectual traditions I am connected to, or at least I have partially studied and attempt to do so. Now, this of course brings up the fact that I have criticized these different civilizations, perhaps, not obviously in terms of the people, because of course people are people wherever you go, and most people are just trying to make something work for themselves, or not necessarily the ideas these civilizations hold dear in and of themselves, but rather more so the historical manifestation of these ideas, how they've been practiced and how they've been institutionalized. For example, you can say that an incredible aspect about Western societies is the development of this kind of tolerance and basic liberty of conscience and speech. And of course, it's not just based on optics alone, but these are very real developments within the Western tradition, as have been pointed out by the likes of Dr. Carol Quigley in his book Tragedy and Hope. However, it's important to note that the West had been hypocritical in its application of such principles. In fact, in many cases, it has gone directly against them. And in fact, more so than just that, it has used such principles as ideological justification for genocide, for wars, for conquest, for imperialism, where really these ideas should be used for the complete opposite of these things. However, it's important to know that a lot of the Western societies have based sort of the organization of their societies on these principles, and these sow the seeds for the tolerance that we see today. Of course, it's important to know that the West, just like any other tradition, any other civilization, has its flaws. And it's not necessarily the case that these liberal ideals are inherently superior than others. In fact, we see in our contemporary society how, these ideas can go wrong and have caused a number of issues. But it's important to note the sort of effect these ideas have had and the very useful contributions the West has made in this manner. And of course, whilst I don't believe that liberty is liberty without responsibility or without consequence, and I believe liberty can only be properly operationalized within the context of a society and tradition, we can definitely applaud and sort of, praise the West for its emphasis, at least, on these basic fundamental rights, right, of freedom of conscience, freedom from state tyranny, of course, even if it has been hypocritical or gone directly against such attitudes or such ideas. Now, people may wonder how I could reconcile that with the Muslim world, with Muslim civilization, because of course, both of those civilizations have developed upon very different lines. But in reality, whilst of course the Muslim world, or in any case, any kind of ideal Muslim state, certainly won't be this kind of liberal utopia, at least in these kinds of Western terms or in this kind of Western model, it's still ideally so will guarantee freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom from state tyranny to a good degree, although, of course, within the context of being operationalized within the Muslim tradition. And so, whilst it may play out in different ways than in the Western tradition, that emphasis on that basic liberty will still be there. For example, in the classical caliphate, we can see how different sects, different philosophies constantly engaged in debates with one another. And in the classical caliphate, there was a great flourishing of intellectual debates and intellectual conflict and dialogue. Of course, just like any other civilization, the Muslim world has not been perfect, and unfortunately, there have been instances of persecution, of state tyranny and repression. Of course, this is well known. But it's important to note, especially in places like Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, which was essentially the intellectual capital of the world in its time, these kinds of debates did occur between these different schools of thought. And the Muslim Birmingham UK scholar Asrar Rashid, in his book Intellectual Intifada, does mention that Islam has the ability to answer these different philosophies and worldviews and provide its own rational and spiritual worldview, whether or not one fully agrees with it. And again, you don't have to agree with everything they say, but you can at least acknowledge that Islam can produce this kind of framework, even if you don't agree with the assumptions it has or the answers it gives or its implications. And if that's the case, then, we should not engage in this kind of state tyranny or state repression. And that will only occur if Muslims don't engage in this kind of overly dogmatic mob mentality type behavior. And Asrar Rashid, in his book Intellectual Intifada, does mention that state tyranny should not be carried out by a kind of ideal Muslim state. And this basic kind of freedom of conscience between different schools of thought to discuss their ideas should be enshrined in the law. I would describe Asrar Rashid's model for the caliphate as the Asrari manhaj, the Asrari methodology regarding the caliphate, or al-manhaj al-asrari fi mas'alat al-khilafa. Al-manhaj al-asrari fi mas'alat al-khilafa. And he mentions that the Muslim state, or at least an ideal one, should not be this kind of Orwellian police state, contrary to the unfortunate reality of many Muslim nations in the present era. It is also interesting to note the kind of libertarian slant of certain modern traditionists, as I have mentioned before. And this actually goes to show that any religious tradition can undergo reasonable developments based on the principles of said tradition when responding or adapting to different ideas that are exposed to it. And so religions and religious traditions can undergo this kind of intellectual development, and they are not simply stagnant or static forces, contrary to what some people may believe. In fact, there are many historical examples of Muslims, and especially Muslim scholars and great Muslim figures, resisting state tyranny and state repression. For example, the very famous incident of the Mihna, the Inquisition of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or the Karami Inquisition of the Ash'aris, or the revolt of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad against the Umayyads when some of those companions viewed the Umayyads as corrupt or oppressive, or even, for example, the Abbasid rebellion, right, which was based on Shu'ubiyya, the equality of different Muslim races, against the Umayyads, who mistreated, in many cases, their non-Arab citizens. Of course, unfortunately, in many cases, state repression did occur that damaged a lot of different schools of thought, and there were a lot of brutal crackdowns, such as on the Mu'tazila, when, for example, the Hanbalis did come into power, or, for example, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad were unfortunately essentially massacred by the Umayyads, for example, during the Battle of Karbala, or the events of, the sacking of Medina during Yazid's rule. But in general and in principle, there are many cases of Muslims standing up to state repression and standing up against what they view as oppression. The concept that I've just discussed then just serves as a certain example that I've given of how, despite me not being an expert, I have tried my best to develop or understand different ideas and concepts. Of course, in many cases, based on deriving things from different works and different books and different ideas. Of course, I do make mistakes or may get things wrong, but I hope that even if you disagree with 99% of what I say, if you agree with even 1% of what I say, you can benefit from it, and that is more than enough. If I do respond slightly aggressively to certain comments, I do apologize. That is my bad. But I oftentimes do so if I feel that I have been misunderstood, or I'm, really just bothered to respond. Otherwise, I just say my piece and leave it at that. And of course, in most cases, I can't be asked to respond to a lot of comments, but it's understandable why people will find certain things I say or certain teachings problematic, for example. And this brings me on to the subject of organized religion that I mentioned before. Of course, I do feel a need to develop a kind of coherent higher philosophical metaphysical framework and understanding. It's important for us to be creative and not reactive or conformative. And on that subject, then, when we approach organized religion, I think it's important to understand that on principle, I agree with religious ideas and religious teachings. In particular, I agree with the essence of Islamic teachings. I agree with the basic faiths the basic tenets of faith of the Muslim religion, right? I am a Muslim. I believe in the basics of the faith and I practice my faith. I believe in a divine being, a God, Allah, and He has revealed His messengers throughout time and place. And I believe in the reality of a kind of non-material existence, a non-material dimension to our existence, right? The soul, all of these things. And I have discussed these in great detail. However, we have to contend with the historical reality that organized religion is a very much human thing. And being a human thing, it is subject to the very worst aspects of our nature. For example, organized religion has been used as a tool of oppression. It has been used as a dogmatic tool to repress certain ideas at times. It has at times been used to limit individual liberty or justify or legitimize some pretty terrible stuff. Also, inevitably, when you read certain teachings or certain aspects of any given religion, right, you may have doubts or you may have rational objections to these things. For example, certain aspects of the various mythologies of these religions or certain ritual practices. And it's understandable that people do have doubts. I mean, it's natural to question, it's natural to think about things in different ways. That's what it means to be human, of course. And it's understandable why people may find certain things problematic insofar as they read something and or they try and understand something, but they can't necessarily fully wrap their heads around it. I think it's important, therefore, to be able to have frank, academic, good faith conversations about such subjects or about such topics and being able to address these questions head on and not simply being dogmatic and not approaching things in an intellectual manner. At times, the maintaining of practicing of certain rituals or certain aspects of a faith at times, become a point of dogma, and it can at times reach the point of absurdity insofar as, genuine liberty or genuine fulfillment may be forsaken for the sake of upholding these things. However, it's important to note that we should separate between religion or the essence of these various religious teachings and organized religion as it is a historical manifestation or a historical human development. In other words, we need to distinguish between the historical manifestation of something and the thing in and of itself. Islam as a faith is very simple, and the basic teachings of Islam are very much consistent to both the mind and to the soul very much. And the very basics of the faith can be understood by anybody. However, people will look at certain things associated with Islam, or they may find certain teachings when not contextualized properly, or certain teachings when not understood properly in their proper context or proper manner may seem problematic. Or, for example, they will see certain historical developments or historical events within the Muslim world and they will find those things problematic. However, it's important to distinguish between that and the essence of the Islamic faith, the basic teachings of the Islamic faith. And Islam, in its essence, I would argue, is a religion that can be known to be true to both the mind and the soul, right? It can be spiritually grasped and it can be intellectually understood. And we have an incredible amount of evidence to show that the main texts, the main religious texts, both the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, have been authentically preserved. And we can find documents of these from within the lifetimes of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? And we can see, for example, how the Isnad system, the system of the chain of transmission, has been developed within the Muslim world by Hadith scholars and by historians. And the emphasis on knowing if certain narrators are authentic or not, and if certain chains of narrations are authentic or not. And this Isnad system is unique in the Muslim world. Virtually no other religious or philosophical community has this thing that the Muslims have, which is the Isnad system, which allows them to authenticate different reports. So we can know to a reasonable degree of certainty that the core essence of the Islamic faith is true, that you believe in one God, that you believe in messages sent in every time and place, right? And that we can believe to a certain degree of certainty, reasonable degree of certainty, that, the religious texts of this faith are preserved authentically. However, of course, certain teachings were not understood properly, or certain historical practices which unfortunately people have engaged with and they have used Islam to justify these may be problematic, of course. And hence, this is why I say that organized religion, meaning religion insofar as practiced by human beings and has been historically manifested over the history of the practice of that faith, may be considered problematic. And so, in that regard, there are very valid critiques of organized religion, right? However, like I said, we can still believe in Islam to be a true faith. We can still believe Islam to be the correct faith. We can still believe that Islam is correct about its beliefs about God or the non-material aspects of our existence. We can believe Islam to be this valid religion and at the same time still maintain these critiques of organized religion. Even somebody like Steven Pinker, who is, this kind of new atheist, and by no means is he a friend of Islam, even he mentions that these kinds of so-called problematic aspects of Islam may be easily interpreted or contextualized or explained in a manner which don't necessarily have to be quote unquote problematic, just like, for example, Christianity or Judaism have done. And of course, Steven Pinker may want Islam to be interpreted in this kind of liberal manner, but I personally don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I don't think Islam has to conform to any ideology or any other philosophy for that matter, because ultimately Islam is its own worldview. It provides its own metaphysical and philosophical framework, it provides its own set of laws, it provides its own ethos and spirituality. So, in that sense, of course, Islam doesn't have to be this kind of liberal faith or reinterpreted or have this kind of reformation per se, but we do need to be able to operationalize the concepts within the faith properly to achieve a just society, a fair society, right? And it doesn't have to necessarily be a liberal one, but we can avoid repeating the kind of mistakes that have been repeated with organized religion, namely the kind of justification of oppression or repression of the individual and basic liberties, or of this kind of overly dogmatic mob mentality attitude, or of justifying state tyranny, for example. Again, whether or not one agrees with the Islamic framework or not, or whether or not one agrees with these Islamic teachings, there is no need to be dogmatic about it. We can have these honest discussions from both sides and we can come to reasonable conclusions about them. But I do believe that Islam can answer these different intellectual objections to it and respond sufficiently well without promoting this kind of dogmatic attitude, and instead engaging in proper intellectual discourse and providing intellectual answers. It can convince people of its veracity.